Professor Piotr Paleczny is eminent pedagogue, the person who is teaching around the world, so I always like to listen what he wants to say about Chopin's music. It is always very interesting, and I wonder what criteria will he use now during the jury deliberations, because jury is still deliberating, and it gives me a wonderful chance to welcome in my studio my next guest, Professor Halina Goldberg.
Thank you for inviting me.
Professor Goldberg, you are the specialist in Chopin, among others, and in his life and in his early life. And I think that it would be especially interesting to ask you about what shaped Chopin's artistic personality, because we are all convinced very much that our composer, born in Żelazowa Wola, was shaped by the country music of 19th century Poland, wasn't he?
The key to understanding Chopin's experience in Poland is in placing him in Warsaw, not in Żelazowa Wola. He was born there. He spent probably just a few months of his life in Żelazowa Wola, and his parents moved the family to Warsaw. He was just an infant when they moved, placing him not just in the capital city, but also in the very, very center, the very heart of Warsaw's intellectual and artistic life. So one has to start with the premise that Chopin was an urbanite.
Well, it is confusing for many people, I think, because we used to think that all his music is founded on the traditional Polish music, and if it is not, so what were the sources of his inspiration?
I think the first thing we need to say is he did travel back to the country during the summer. He spent the vacations, his vacations, either in Żelazowa Wola or in some other country estates. So he did have some contact with country music, so that's a given. Mm-hmm. But he did not need direct models of country music to be exposed, for instance, to mazurkas. By the time Chopin was born, mazurka was steadily becoming a fixture in the city.
Oh.
One of Chopin's contemporaries wrote somewhat later about the period of the teens and the 20s, saying Warsaw was saturated with the sounds of the mazurka, while the peasants outside of Warsaw were dancing clumsy waltzes.
Wow, it's fascinating. Warsaw at that time was rather not very big city comparing to such cultural centers as Vienna or Paris, of course. And well, Chopin decided to leave country to seek for career and to seek for further education. But he found here some interesting milieu, you told.
So Warsaw, at the start of the century, Warsaw was a rather provincial city at the start of the 19th century. And of course, one has to remember that this is the period of partitioned Poland. So Warsaw is at the beginning of the century under Prussian control, and then during much of Chopin's life under Russian control. But what happened in between is the Congress of Vienna. Mm-hmm. And during the Congress of Vienna, the Polish kingdom was formed by Tsar Alexander I. It was sort of an experiment. It was an experiment in how would a limited sovereignty work in a region around Warsaw. So there was a Polish government which focused on creating economic opportunities and creating cultural opportunities. And they were really coming up with fantastic ideas about what the city needs culturally, throwing money at cultural institutions. So during the 15 years between 1815 and 1830, when Chopin left, or most of that time, because the last few years things changed, there were new cultural institutions were being established. The conservatory was established, and it just goes on. And Chopin found himself in a city that was just alive, that had terrific musical scene, that had very well functioning national theater, that staged Polish and foreign operas. With operas, for instance, the delay in premieres of, for instance, Rossini's operas was maybe up to 3 years. Some of Rossini's operas were performed in Warsaw even within a year from their premiere in Paris, let's say. So it was a terrific place to be in.
It is interesting what you are saying about Rossini, because in your book, Music in Chopin's Warsaw, I read that, in fact, Rossini's influence on young Chopin was much bigger, maybe, than Bellini's influence. And the popular stereotype, maybe, is that Chopin took all his bel canto abilities from Bellini's music. But it was Rossini.
The Rossini that we tend to listen to today is the Rossini of the Barber of Seville. This is a very different style of opera with rich ornamentation, with kind of virtuoso displays and so forth. But of course there are many terrific Rossini operas, his opera serie, that are very seldom performed today. A good example of such an opera is Otello, Rossini's Otello.
Yeah.
And there are just some stunning, beautiful examples of bel canto. Remember that Chopin did not meet Bellini until he arrived in Paris, but he is writing bel canto style movements, for instance, the slow movements of the concerti that we have heard, before he leaves Warsaw.
And Chopin was for all his life a big opera lover.
He was.
Although he did not write any.
He didn't, and the hope of his teachers, of his peers, of his family was that he will write, he will become the great Polish opera composer. He continues to receive letters from prominent people well into the 30s, encouraging him to write a Polish opera even in Paris. And in Paris it really became impractical. But while he was in Poland, he was an opera composer in training. He was going to the opera every opportunity he had. He listened to local opera singers, but there were also some great opera singers that traveled to Warsaw from abroad. He was training his ear to prepare to write an opera. He never did.
Why it was so important for his teachers, his family, why it was so important to write an opera and not the piano music?
Opera was the most respected genre at the time. Symphony is gradually becoming a peer of opera. But in the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, you did not prove your prowess as a composer until you wrote an opera. You were not considered a serious composer. And in fact, Elsner admonishes Chopin in one of the letters from the 30s. Don't just be a concertizer, this is the word he used. Write an opera. You are not going to be a serious composer until you write an opera. So that's one reason. The other one, of course, has to do with opera being the locus of Polish national identity. Poles needed an opera. Poles needed operas on historic stories, stories that were helping to build Polish national identity. And Kurpiński and Elsner were already composing operas of this sort, but they were hoping that Chopin will elevate it to an international level, that he will write a Polish opera that will be good enough to be performed abroad.
You mentioned that Chopin was trained to become a great composer. He was very well educated young man. What his education looked like?
He started his piano lessons with Żywny, who was not a very good teacher. He was not even a pianist. One of Chopin's peers later wrote that Żywny taught half of Warsaw, and only Chopin learned anything from Żywny.
So Żywny did not spoil Chopin, maybe.
He did not. I think in many ways one can really speak of him being self-taught as a pianist. He probably had some models from other important pianists who traveled through Poland. For instance, Szymanowska was a true concert pianist, and we know from Chopin's letters and from other sources that he did not miss a single concert of Szymanowska. He might have also heard her in salons and so forth. So there might have been models, but there was not a teacher that was able to give him the level of. So yeah, I think it's a good way to say maybe because he was self-taught, he developed a rather idiosyncratic technique. But the story was very different with composition because he had an incredibly good composition teacher. Elsner was just a good composer, not a great composer. But he was an excellent composition teacher. He left us enough information about his teaching for us to be able to get a sense of how he was teaching. And perhaps the most important thing was that he was recognizing the need to encourage his students to cultivate their individual style. And for us, it's a kind of a given. We assume, yes, that's a normal thing. That's what a teacher would do. But it by no means was that a given at the start of the 19th century. This was a very new approach to teaching. So he allowed Chopin to follow his instincts while helping him shape his understanding of form, his understanding of narrative, his understanding of specific techniques.
And Chopin also attended at some lectures at Warsaw University.
At Warsaw University, the structure of the conservatory, and by the way, the conservatory was one of the first such schools in Europe. There was the Parisian Conservatory. The next conservatory that was established was the Prague Conservatory. And then there was the Warsaw Conservatory, which was established in 1809, reorganized, and then reopened around 1820. And the structure of the conservatory was such that it was a part of the very young Warsaw University, and Chopin was taking advantage of being, well, he was in the midst of the university anyway for other reasons, but he tells us what lectures he's attending. He attends lectures in history, he attends lectures in literature, and so forth.
And there was another very specific thing around Chopin during his life in Warsaw, the culture of salons. Mm-hmm. It was the important place of reaching intellectual experiences and artistic experiences. Mm-hmm. What was the salon during 19th century?
The salon was the heartbeat of both domestic and intellectual and artistic life. It depends whose salon. Yeah. If this was just a regular middle-class salon, they were providing entertainment for each other. Everybody who had some level of education was trained to play. Remember, this is before the time of TV, before the time of radio, no iPads. You have the music that you make. So everybody was making music.
Yeah.
And if the salon belonged to people who were more intellectually or artistically inclined, the level of conversation would be different and the level of music would be different. And there were some salons that were specifically dedicated to music. These were salons where once a week people would gather specifically for concerts. And people who would gather were music lovers and professional musicians. So these were people who were listening to different music, playing different music and listening with different ears. This was active, attentive listening. We have trivialized the salon. We for decades we associated the salon with the trivial and the frivolous and so forth. And at its best, the salon was the best place to have music performance, and that's really what happened in Paris once Chopin got to Paris. Much of his performance happened in salons.
Yes, he decided to be the salon performer, not the concert virtuoso. Of course, he did not like big gatherings, but were there any other reasons that he decided to have such an intimate career?
I think there were a number of reasons. One of them was, and that this has been said a number of times, his pianistic style. It was a style that was very nuanced, very subtle, and it worked better in a smaller place. He also preferred the piano that worked better in a smaller place. He preferred the Pleyel rather than the Erard, which was a newer instrument with newer technology and capable of larger sound. So that's one reason. But I think there's another reason. We don't quite understand what the concert culture was like. When we think about the concert in the beginning of the 19th century or during the 30s and 40s, we assumed that it was like our concerts, and it was not. It was an acrobatic show.
Oh.
The culture of virtuosity was something new. It actually pervaded other areas of culture, not just music. It started with virtuosity pertained to public display of one's talent. The talents that were displayed were chess playing, cooking. Virtuoso cooking is a new skill. Magic, and musical virtuosity. Virtuoso performances, first of all, were programmed as variety concerts. So you would have, for instance, a first movement of a symphony as an opener, then one movement of a concerto, then an aria, then a clarinet piece, then something else, an intermission, then maybe another movement of a symphony, then the second and the third movement of a concerto, then another aria, maybe another clarinet piece, and at the end, the pianist would have been expected, or the instrumentalist would have been expected to improvise as well. But some of those performances took on such an aura of showmanship, Paganini's, for instance. Paganini would have performances that were staged, that had sets, that had choruses of monks and ghosts in the background, and it was a show. And I don't think this is what Chopin wanted. He wanted to dedicate himself to a more serious music. He didn't want to be a monkey on display.
Yes, surely. And then he decided rather to be a creator and a composer than a pianist. Thank you very much for this inspiring interview. And if you would like to know maybe something more about this magical Warsaw of Chopin's yacht, you can just read Professor Goldberg book, very interesting book, Music in Chopin's Warsaw. It is edited in English already, and I hope very much that soon it would be available also in Polish.